Wood Museum. And at the beginning I thought, this is really too much. You know, this is a memorial to those who died at Delville Wood. And today's talk has actually become for me a beginning to understand something about nation building, beginning to understand that you need to create a shared history. And we now have a majority black government that is doing great honor to white soldiers who died in the First World War and the Second World War, because they are now incorporated into the history of the First War and the Second War. And I find it very moving to see how it is being done. So to a certain extent, this lecture is about that learning experience that I have recently had. And I see that some friends of mine are here, and with their relatives, we were on the walking trip. So I'm shocked and horrified you didn't come too. Lazy, lazy people. Anyway. White South Africans went to war from 1914 to 1918 wearing this particular cap badge. Unity is strength, Eendracht maakt mag. And as we all know, this motto was very misplaced. Just 14 years before, the British Empire was engaged in a devastating war with the independent republics of this country. Boer, commandos, and British regulars fought with great bitterness, and the legacy lasted until very recently. When I became a judge, I can remember going into the judge's tea room in Johannesburg, and this is 20 years ago, and we have these round leather 10 chairs gathered, and I remember one day I was sitting, and every single judge I was sitting with was the grandson of a Boer war general. We had Paul Kruger's grandson, Frikkie Elof. We had Jan Smuts's grandson. We had De La Rey's grandson. We had a Herzog grandson. And I was the only one who in theory was on the other side, except my ancestors weren't in South Africa at that stage. Anyway, the war ended in the capitulation of the Boers, and it left a legacy of great bitterness. There might have been peace, but it was very much on British terms. The Cape, Natal, Orange Free State, and Transvaal remained colonies, subject to imperial government. And of course, because it was imperial government, with the outbreak of war in 1914, South Africa, as a British dominion without any say-so, was automatically at war. But our involvement in this war was not popular in the country or within the Cape Parliament. Not least was this shown in the White Rebellion, which ranged across the Transvaal and the Free State provinces. White South African forces, as we know, saw service in German Southwest Africa. And you will remember from the Free State, from the Cape, and a very short campaign with very little loss. White South Africans struggled in East Africa, German East Africa, for 3 years. Not much gain. The purpose was to deny harbours and wireless stations to the German forces, but also very much in the foreground was to enlarge the British Empire, and not too far in the background was the great desire on the part of Smuts and Botha to enlarge the South African Union. And in France, as we know, white South African troops died shoulder to shoulder with the English, the Scots, the Canadians, the Australians. And then what was called the sacred ground of Delville Wood was chosen as the site for the White South African National Memorial. And here was the first cross erected, and you can see the beginnings of a wood growing. In 1930s, the memorial was built. The wood as yet had not regrown. And you will see at the top of the arch are the twins, Castor and Pollux, who are now immortalized as Gemini. And that was to signify the unification of the two great races of South Africa, the English and the Afrikaans. And as John Bachen said in the history of the South African forces in France, the The story of the South Africans in the war is the achievement of a people, that is the South African people, in which the union of two race stocks is in the process of consummation. And the message essentially at the end of the war was that white South Africa can and still could participate proudly on a world stage, and that white South Africans had been and would remain united against common foes and in common purpose. But this version of history, as we know, is incorrect and it is incomplete. It ignores the many, many black South Africans who offered to join the fighting forces and were offered that and were denied that opportunity. It ignores the nearly 66 black South Africans who did enlist and did serve. It ignores the some 17,000 men who bore weapons in the Cape Corps. Now, this of course is because of South Africa's not very recent past. Since the arrival of the white colonists in 1652, the indigenous occupiers of the country had been harassed, their land had been stolen, and they had been conquered in every possible way. There had been battles and rebellions. There had been very surly and very reluctant peace between black and white. And for the government of South Africa at the time of the beginning of war, the Union's policy was to segregate and to subjugate the majority black population so as to minimize the association of blacks with whites and to safeguard white interests, as we will see. And of course, it wasn't only black South Africans, it was also colored men and women who'd been brought as slaves from the Dutch East Indies to the Cape of Good Hope by the Dutch East India Company. Now, just 5 years before the war, in 1909, prior to the Union of South Africa being proclaimed, a delegation of colored and black men from the African People's Organization and the African Congress traveled to London. They were accompanied by the former Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, W.P. Schreiner. And the reason they went was to attempt to persuade the British government that the South Africa Act should entrench the right of all South Africans, black and white, to have the franchise. Interestingly, we have here Dr. Abdurrahman of the African People's Organization. We have the Reverend Rubusana, let me find him, here he is. And we have Mr. Tengo Jobavu, who is editor of Imvu. You'll hear about them later. Well, their representations were unsuccessful. We did not have a universal franchise for black and white men. We then had coming along the 1913 Land Act. The legislation was proposed, and the intention was to limit the extent of land which could be owned communally by black South Africans. At that stage, it was 10% of the land, and the legislation said that natives could neither buy nor sell land. So another delegation went off to London to attempt to persuade the British government not to permit this legislation. And again, we've got the Reverend Rubusana, and you might remember Sol Plaatje. And there's also John Dube of the African National Congress. Well, their delegation was without success. The 1913 Land Act was passed, and it was the first pillar of segregation legislation. And then, as war became imminent, Prime Minister Louis Botha felt it was necessary to make an appeal to black South Africans. And so on the 1st of August 1914, he released an official statement regarding the impending hostilities in Europe, and specifically addressed to the natives of South Africa. And he said, "There is, however, little possibility at present of any trouble which need seriously affect the natives. The government therefore trusts that the natives will display their customary loyalty to His Majesty and to the Union of South Africa by going quietly about their daily work." And they did. The response on the whole of natives was fairly lukewarm, although you've got Sol Plaatje going on a lecture tour of the United States, and you can see the topic of his address is brotherhood and empire. And the Reverend Dr. Rubusana, who I mentioned, he was a former pupil at Lovedale College. He was the first black member of the Cape Provincial Council, and he wrote to the Minister of Native Affairs, who happened to be the Prime Minister, Louis Botha, and he offered to raise a levy of 5,000 able-bodied black men to proceed to German Southwest Africa, provided that the government was prepared to equip and arm this force for the front, and he himself offered to accompany them. Now, it wasn't that unusual that quote-unquote coloured troops were to fight in this war. The British had used what they called coloured troops in all fields of combat. Here are some West Indians. The French had used Senegalese and people from the colonies such as Morocco and elsewhere. Here are the Indian troops. But the South African government declined to take up the offer. They did not want to use natives. And so the Secretary of the Native Affairs Department was instructed by Botha to write as follows. Apart from other considerations, the present war is one which has its origins amongst the white people of Europe, and the government are anxious to avoid the employment of its native citizens in a war against whites. In other words, no blacks need apply. But South Africa had also in the past, its various colonial governments had in the past used coloured troops. The coloureds in South Africa through the Cape Corps had a tradition of military service throughout the country. Do we have Martian? No.
Excuse me.
Yes.
That thing you hold in your hand, it's near the computer over there.
Okay, thank you. So this was the badge that was now decided to recruit and for the Cape Coloureds to serve under. A recruiting committee was set up, and the very same Dr. Abdurrahman, who had gone off in the delegation concerning the Union of South Africa Act, was on this recruiting committee. The Cape Town City Hall was flooded with recruits. Only men of exceptionally good character were eligible and considered for service, and the response was absolutely overwhelming. Recruits from Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, Worcester, and all over. They were sent to Simonstown, here they are, at a Boer War prisoner of war camp. And that is where they were trained. And there is a wonderful book that one can find in the public domain by a Captain Difford who served with them. And he is so enthusiastic about the caliber of the men with whom he served until late in 1919. Anyway, the 1st Battalion of the Cape Corps set off for East Africa in February 1916 on the Armadale Castle. And for the first 9 months, they were used as support troops. They guarded bases, they patrolled roads, they built bridges, and they were on transport and hospital duties. Many soldiers succumbed to malaria. By the end of April 1916, at least half of the Cape Corps battalions were either in hospital or sick on duty. But then a series of maps in Captain Difford's book shows how the Cape Corps were now used to participate very actively in campaigns against the Germans. There was a dawn bayonet attack against the German position at Makaliniso. The Cape Corps was sent to support a Nigerian brigade at Nkundu. In January 1917, they were, with a Nigerian regiment and the Kashmir Mountain Battery, successful in advancing upon German positions at a place called Kibongo. And many of Cape Corps soldiers won medals. These ones are DCMs, Distinguished Conduct Medals. By the end of 1917, the Corps was ordered to advance against the enemy, and they came under very heavy artillery fire at Mkungu and suffered loss. Now, I have a series of very bad pictures from the war in Egypt, but it's all I've managed to get. And here we have General Allenby, who was commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, and he is actually inspecting the Cape Corps, which was sent to Egypt. Initially, they were escorting prisoners of war and they were involved in communications work. And then they discovered that nobody intended to actually use them in a fighting capacity. They protested. The protest went up as far as Allenby, and they were then now used in fighting. Here they are engaged in bayonet training. And the comment by this Captain Difford is that the army was now far more professionally organized than it had been in East Africa. The campaign was systematic and methodical, and as Difford says, we'd left the amateur stage behind us and we were by way of becoming professionals. So the training went on, and here is a Lewis gun section. They were then, the 1st Battalion of the Cape Corps was assigned to an infantry brigade of the Welsh Division, and they entered into the line against the 53rd Division of the Turkish Army, 10 miles north of what is today Ramallah. They faced artillery fire for approximately a month. And here they are at a church brigade after their attack on a place called Square Hill. In mid-September of 1918, they attacked Square Hill. They took 181 prisoners and they captured an enemy field gun. They lost very few men. But the next action was taking another hill just behind Square Hill, Kurjabait. They didn't have artillery support and they lost 151 men with 101 wounded and 1 taken prisoner. And it is said that these actions of the Cape Corps were decisive in paving the way for Alani to break through to Damascus and to, quote, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. And it's interesting, the Cape Corps armed fighting did not go to France. They went to the Middle East and were there a very long time. And in 1919, they were putting down rebellions by the Egyptians against the British forces. But let's go back to South African politics and what happened to the natives. After consultation with the South African Native National Congress, the government eventually recruited over 33,000 blacks in Southwest Africa as drivers, carriers, animal pack leaders. But it was very clear what they were being recruited for, not for fighting purposes, but for that class of employment that was exclusively or ordinarily suited to natives, such as drivers, leaders of oxen, and general labourers in the supply and other units of the Defence Force. And if you got it wrong and you thought they were going to be leaders, that's why you had to put in the words oxen, just in case somebody thought it might be another kind of leader. And another 18,000 black South Africans served in German East Africa. A large number of them died or were incapacitated by tropical diseases and the rigors of that campaign, particularly malaria. But the problem was the fighting that was going on endlessly in France and Belgium. Fighting soldiers had enough to do. They dug trenches, they built bridges, they built dugouts, they carried their kits, they carried their weapons, they had to carry up the tea and the bread in the mornings, they had to carry up ammunition to the front line, and then it was expected they had to fight. So Labour or pioneer battalions had to be used. So here we've got a Labour battalion working in the forests because trees had to be cut down to make railway sleepers. And labourers were used to obtain, build, supply and transport essentials for the war effort. Roads had to be built, in this case by the Australians. Ammunition shells had to be loaded on the side of the road so they could be picked up and transported to artillery batteries. Sandbags had to be filled and then transported to either support trenches, alternatively to protect gun batteries. And as you can see, here are fighting troops at the Somme working on roads, working on clearing, and less could they be spared to work in dockyards and at railheads. It was an enormous waste of able-bodied men, especially as the war progressed and what was called wastage. They never talked about dead or wounded. They just talked about wastage. And as the wastage increased, every able-bodied man was needed. So Labour battalions were recruited from men who were considered unfit to serve as combatants. But even so, the Allies had to look elsewhere. So they looked in Indochina. In 1915, it was estimated about 60,000 men were needed. So Indochina, the West Indies, India, and South Africa were approached. Here you have the Indo-Chinese labourers who released a lot of white men for soldiers. And there are many graves throughout France and Belgium, and the Chinese gravestones have writing in Chinese, and they all say then, a good reputation endures forever. And you have Chinese labourers loading skips. Now, the Colonial Secretary wrote to the British government in October 1915 about the approach to the South African government, and this is what Bonar Law said. No proposal for training natives upon a large scale is likely to be acceptable to that government or to the British or Dutch inhabitants of the Union, as the return after peace of a large body of trained and disciplined black men would create extreme difficulties and might seriously menace the supremacy of the white. But Botha pondered upon the request that was given to him, and he decided that he would dispatch a contingent of native men to France. After all, he was Minister of Native Affairs, so he had direct command and control over the unit. He didn't even refer this matter to Parliament. And he made sure that the imperial government paid all costs. And secondly, he was very concerned to protect South Africa. And he was worried that the imperial government, if he said no, would go off and recruit native men from Basutoland, Bechuanaland, and Swaziland. And this would undermine his control over native South Africans. And then, of course, a refusal to the imperial government. Oh no, I'm taking it off. A request from the imperial government. Why? Because South Africa had very clear designs on German Southwest Africa, even at that stage. My lifetime was spent with Southwest Africa being considered a sort of a part of South Africa. Well, it started before the First World War. So he agreed to the native Labour contingent, and there was a lot of opposition. The Daily Dispatch, for instance, said, "This is absolutely appalling. The natives will find themselves in a totally different social environment. It will be surprising if they do not return to South Africa spoiled. Further, it will not fail to be noticed that the pay to be given to native labourers is twice that which the men of the overseas contingent are receiving. The natives are to get £3 a month, and the men of the 1st Infantry get a shilling a day." In Parliament, there was also opposition. General Hertzog's National Party was the main opposition, but they were opposed to South Africa's involvement in the war, whether it was blacks or whites or English or Afrikaners or anybody. But a member of Parliament, J.B. Wessels, said the following: "Did they realise that the coloured man, when he donned uniform, said to the white man, 'I am your equal, and the equal to your wives and children'?" But the native Labour contingent went off. Here is a roll from one of the recruiting. It is very difficult to read, but let me just show you. We have Johannes Marema, Johannes, George, John, Joseph, Andres, Stephanus, Edward, Devises, Richard, Andrew, Barney, Cain, Joseph, Elliot. Not a great deal of detail about who and what the men arm. The plan was to recruit 5 battalions of 2,000 men each. And by January 1917, the 10,000 men had been recruited. But then the imperial government got greedy, rather desperate, and said, we actually want 40,000 labourers, 10,000 won't do. But there was very little success. Because basically what had now happened was that black men were saying, no, we will not enlist. Why should we serve a white government who we don't trust and a king who's already let us down so badly? And obviously there was fear of quite a lot of the unknown. The sea, the Germans, not coming home again. And there was the feeling, quite understandably, that the war in Europe had nothing to do with black men. But anyway, the black South Africans who were in the Native Labour Corps entered into a contract, but they worked as general labourers in the overseas Native Labour Contingent for the imperial government for the period of 12 months, and the rate of pay was £3 a month. So who were the men who went? Well, here is Mr. Joseph Chite. He was a schoolmaster from the Hebron district near Pretoria. He left a wife and 5 children, and he went with his friends Benjamin Mocharosi and Pinafas More. The majority, though, were young men who'd grown up with little opportunity for education. They herded cattle in the tribal areas, or they worked for money in the mines or on white-owned farms, or as unskilled labourers in the town. One man described how his chief was in charge of his induction. Our chief called us and told us that the British government had asked for soldiers to go overseas in order to participate in the First World Great War. I informed the native commissioner that I was employed in Johannesburg and had not brought my belongings that I had left there. The native commissioner and the chief promised that everything that was mine, including my wages, could be collected by my mother. And my employer would be notified that I was called to arms by the government. We left for Cape Town the following day. Stamela Jason Jingos was of Swazi descent. He was born and educated in Basutoland. And his life was written up by my anthropology lecturer when I was at Rhodes. The book is called A Chief is the Chief by the People, which is a play on Umtunguntungabantu. A person is a person because of other people. He had spent a period of time working underground in the mines, and then he was employed as a salesman of clothing for Mr. Joseph Sachs in Germiston. And in his account, he really wanted to see the world and have an adventure. And when he returned, he talked about how for many years he actually wrote letters to white soldiers that he had met during the war in France. William Bonifacius Matumetse was only 16. His father was the Reverend Native Matumetse, one of the early pastors of the Lutheran Church, living near Groblersdal in the Transvaal. And his grandfather Thomas had also been an evangelist. His parents refused him permission to enlist, and then they made the mistake of saying, go and ask your grandfather. And he asked his grandfather, who said, of course you're going. And another person is the Reverend Isaac Joba. He's a Xhosa from the Eastern Cape. He'd been educated at Lovedale. He was one of a party of 5 evangelists who went off to Nyasaland in 1876. He was a teacher in Uitenhage. He was a clerk and interpreter at the Magistrates' Court in Port Elizabeth. And it was after that he entered the ministry of the Congregational Church and worked in Fort Beaufort. And he was recruited to the Labour Corps as a clerk and interpreter. And the question, of course, is why did men like this actually answer the call for recruits? And I suppose, just as with white volunteers, the rhetoric of the appeal to serve your king and country was the emotional response. There was the daily cash wage, there was adventure, they went off like everybody else with groups of friends and family. And yes, many of them would have preferred to fight, but they still came forward. And for some of them, like Mr. Jingos, there was the desire to travel and learn and to see for themselves what this great, wonderful European civilization was like. So the 1st Battalion of the Cape Corps, and this is one company of it, arrived at Le Havre in November 1916, and then subsequent battalions kept arriving. And here, with the beard, is Captain Brownlee, who was a very influential and very, quote-unquote, thinking person on native problems, unquote. And they were sent to work along the coast. And this is the part of the coast. They arrive at Le Havre, and all along the coast, the ships are arriving in the material at Dieppe, which we'll come to later, and then all the way up to Boulogne. It's also the areas where the white soldiers are arriving and where many of the hospitals are. They also worked all over the front. So they came in from the coast, and we have a lot of soldiers around here, and as the front moves forward, so they move forward. They are at railheads, they are at ammunition dumps, and as the material, the ammunition, the supplies need to go forward, so they are moving forward all the time. The South African authorities issued regulations to segregate the black soldiers from, quote, alien influences. Brigadier General Stone said the following: "The wives and daughters of our settlers in the black man's country live in deadly peril of rape and murder. It is absolutely essential that the Kaffir should regard white women as unapproachable. South African natives are not permitted outside their camps except when accompanied by an officer or a European NCO. They are prohibited from entering or being served with wine, beer or spirits in any estaminet or place where liquor is sold. All ranks are forbidden to purchase on their behalf or to give them intoxicating liquor. All houses and camps are out of bound to natives. They should not be allowed to enter shops or other business premises unless under European escort. It is important to take steps to ensure that natives are not allowed to enter or to be entertained in the houses of Europeans. Under the conditions under which they are living in France, they are not to be trusted with white women. And any native found wandering about without a pass and not under the escort of a white NCO should be returned to his unit under guard or handed over to the military police." Now, in total, just over 25,000 native men were recruited and over 20,000 served in France. All men of the Native Labour Corps returned to the Union by September 1917. It was an expensive exercise. People spent 3 months travelling to and from Europe on a boat. They therefore, with their contract of 12 months, only worked for 9 months. And with this kind of segregation and compounds, it almost used up more men, able-bodied men, segregating them and controlling them. But the official history states that 5,635 black and coloured men died. And the actual number is possibly much higher when you think of that roll I showed you where the details were as sparse as Phineas, Samuel and Cain. Now, selecting officers was also a difficult task. Firstly, they had to be unfit for service with fighting units. They had to have a good knowledge of a native language, and they had to have experience in working with natives. So the people who were chosen were retired civil servants, men who had handled natives on the farms, or mines, or in government departments. So here we've got a group of officers. We've got Dr. Hertzlit, Lieutenant Samuel Emsley and Lieutenant Richardson. Samuel Emsley had farmed, he lived in Umtata, he retired as the Chief Licensing Officer of Transkei. Samuel Richardson came from Durban. He was engaged in labour recruiting for the mines. He had served in Southwest Africa and German East Africa, but he was discharged because of malaria. Captain Brownlee, who I mentioned, had been the Chief Magistrate in the Transkei. As I say, he was known for his forward-looking views on the native problem, and he was known as Busobengwe. Apparently it means tiger face. Dr. Hertzlit, who I showed you, was a medical missionary in Natal. He had a wife and 4 children, and he was working in the military hospital in Wynberg. And his wife, Jessie, wrote afterwards, "Our happy and useful life in Wynberg was brought by a sudden request to Lewis. Would he volunteer to go to France with the newly recruited native Labour Contingent? It was desirable to staff it with men who spoke a native language and knew the people well. One of his brothers had been killed at Gallipoli, and he answered yes. Chaplains went. The Reverend John Lennox taught at Lovedale, and the Reverend Hallows ministered as a missionary in Natal. So further brigades kept arriving at Le Havre. The companies were sent off to perform general labour at railheads, at ammunition dumps. They were employed on road making and at railheads. As you can see, they loaded and offloaded. They were at camps, at ports, such as Le Havre, Dieppe, Boulogne, and on the Somme. There was a company at Arc where they were involved in quarrying. And they were particularly wanted in quarries because they knew how to use dynamite. And the British were very anxious about letting German prisoners of war have access to dynamite. Other labourers digging sand for sandbags, hauling logs. And then King George V came to inspect them and said, in July 1917, "You also form part of my great armies who are fighting for the liberties and freedom of my subjects of all races and creeds throughout the empire. Without munitions of war, my armies cannot fight. Without food, they cannot live. You are helping to send these things to them each day. And in doing so, you are hurling your assegais at the enemy and hastening the destruction which awaits him." And a white ox was then presented to the men whom he had inspected. Now, one of the companies I've mentioned was at this little village called Arc-la-Bataille. It is near the town of Dieppe. It is on a railway line, which makes absolute sense. It has an amazing and enormous church, which of course they were not allowed to attend, but they were allowed to perform for locals. There was a concert in a schoolroom where they sang to an audience of school children, villagers, and French troops. And afterwards they went up to the local chateau and there was another performance for Madame. And Captain Brownlee and his officers dined with Madame, and the men had dinner in the kitchens. They also attended a sports day, and there were a lot of interregimental sports days, and there was long jump, and there was soccer, and there was rugby, and all sorts of things. And here you can see the officers are showing a very kindly interest. Now, at the forests where they were working, the men of the 1st Battalion of the Labour Corps sometimes heard the sound of distant guns and machine gun fire. And as more and more arrived, they moved further and further forward, closer and closer to the front line. The Reverend Hallows describes how the Corps had orders to march about 14 miles from Albert. And he said, but the men had been in a crowded ship for 2 months, had been short of food for 2 days on the train, they had heavy packs to carry. The roads had been fairly deep in snow, but a continuous procession of motor transport had transformed this into deep slush. The men began to straggle. Some were completely done, but mostly it was feet that gave in. Plenty of lorries were passing, so I kept getting lifts for the most crippled. The British Tommy is a kindly fellow. Near the front there's a wonderful spirit of comradeship. Everyone seems to be out to help everyone else, and the lorry drivers saved the situation for us. He also wrote about time in the camp. We were about 4 miles or less from the nearest part of the German lines. There was something happening almost every night, as we were behind the most aggressive position of the British front near Ancre. Our own heavy guns were practically all around us and were never silent. At night, the roar of our barrage of fire was often continuous for several hours, sometimes all night. The vibration occasionally used to bring part of the woodwork of our hut down. The cold was intense, as much as 27 degrees of frost. Work was continuous, Sundays included. The trains had to be offloaded as soon as they arrived. And it is not surprising that the men suffered badly from the weather of a very serious winter. Chilblains, trenchfoot, frostbite were common. Men required amputation of their lower limbs, and there were other problems of pneumonia, bronchitis, and TB. Mr. Martley described how aeroplanes nearly every evening attacked us, and we had nothing to defend ourselves with. Only the whites were given arms. This camp was twice in flames during enemy attacks, he said. Mr. Jingo said, there was the wail of the siren. British soldiers raced to their trenches. The sound of planes was heard and 5 German aircraft came into view. The planes started dropping bombs on us. One fell close by, but it buried itself in the sand and no one was hurt. Our soldiers were shooting at the plane until they passed over us and disappeared. They reappeared shortly after. 3 of them this time diving low from the direction of the hospital. The soldiers warned us not to move until they had gone. Then one of the planes was hit and it crashed to the earth. Its 2 companions flew on over the town of Dieppe. When we found the wreckage, there were 3 men in it. 2 were dead, but the 3rd was still breathing. The Basotho wanted to finish him off, but Captain Geddy stopped us and the fellow was taken to Dieppe Hospital. And you will remember that village of Arklabatel. So I made my first visit there this year, and you can see the village on the river, and this is the cemetery in which many of the South African Labour Contingent are buried who worked in this particular area. And if you look over in this direction, I realized as I sat here that I could actually see the cranes of the Dieppe harbour. Now, these soldiers had somehow or other to get to France. Oh, sorry, and these are gravestones from there. They had to get to France. Here are Nigerians on board a ship which might be the Mendi, because the Mendi was in the Liverpool West Africa service until it was chartered by the British government. In West Africa, she was fitted as a troop ship, and she loaded Nigerian troops at Lagos, transported them to Mombasa for service in East Africa, and then returned to Cape Town, where the fittings were overhauled. On the 16th of January 1970, the Mendi left Cape Town. Gold bullion was also loaded, and she travelled in convoy with other ships carrying Australian troops. This is the Mendi, British and Africa Steam Navigation Company, not a large ship. And here are the holds, and essentially, as you can imagine, that is where our crash is going to happen. There were forward holds, which were the largest, and that is where the troops were accommodated, and also between decks. The Mendi was commanded by Captain Henry Yardley, and he was assisted by a crew of 89, both British and West Indian. The Mendi sailed to Sierra Leone, transferred the consignment of £5 million of gold bullion to another ship, and then carried on to, well, while on the ship, they did everything that people do on troop ships. They exercised, they did boxing. Dr. Hartslett got them boxing gloves to have boxing matches, and they had evening classes. On the ship, there were lifeboats and there were rafts. The rafts are made of copper tanks with a wooden grating over the top, and they could take approximately 920 people. There were also lifebuoys around the rails and lifebags for everybody to wear. And in fact, the troops had to carry their own lifebelts with them at all times and use them as pillows at night. Now, as I say, the Mendi went on to Lagos, transferred the gold bullion, and then went on to Plymouth. At Plymouth, recruits for the Royal Flying Corps who'd been on the ship left, and the military passengers left the ship. And then the Mendi sailed on. But at the same time, there was a ship, the SS Darrow, which had left Buenos Aires. The Darrow had gone to Le Havre, landed her passengers there, and was now going in the direction of an English port. So both of them were travelling now in opposite directions, Le Havre to Plymouth and vice versa. The weather was dull, overcast and misty, and on the afternoon of the 20th of February, the Mendi sailed from Plymouth, escorted by a destroyer, the HMS Brisk. At about 5:30 in the evening, it was practically dark. Men were stationed on a crow's nest, on the forecastle heads. There were officers on the bridge, and black troops were stationed around about the ship as lookouts. They steamed on in darkness. They had oil sidelights, because oil lamps instead of electric lamp, because of greater visibility in fog. And the whistle continuously sounded. And we know all this because HMS Brisk, the destroyer which accompanied them, saw all this and heard all this. The Darrow steamed on ahead at full speed without regard to changes in the weather. They didn't sound a whistle. And the Darrow's bow then crashed into the starboard side of the Mendi at right angles. It was nearly 5 o'clock in the morning of the 21st of February. And the Darrow cut into the Mendi from keel to deck to a depth of about 20 feet. Now the men standing on the Mendi were hurled to the deck by the force of the impact. The first to die as the bow smashed into them were those who lay in their blankets on the deck or in the hold. The watertight holds were burst open. The ships then drifted apart, leaving this huge open hole into the side of the Mendi, into which the sea poured. Men struggled out of their blankets and tried to climb up the ladders out of the hold, but it is thought that most of the men never made their way to the deck and drowned in the blackness of the hold. The captain gave the order to lower the lifeboats, and there was obviously a struggle in the darkness to lower those boats. But as the Mendi sank, it was very, very quick. The ship listed heavily to starboard, and so it became virtually impossible to get out the port side lifeboats. But most of the rafts did get away from the Mendi. And there is oral tradition that the Reverend Yorba cried out to the men on these sinking decks, and that the men with whom he was took off their boots and stamped a death dance on the deck of the sinking ship. And supposedly what he said is, "Be quiet and calm, my countrymen, for what is taking place is exactly what you came to do. Brothers, we are now drilling the drill of death. I, Xhosa, say you are all my brothers, Zulus, Swazis, Pondos, Basutus. We die like brothers. We are the sons of Africa. Raise your cries, brothers, for though they made us leave our weapons at home, our voices are left with our bodies." Now, it is now generally accepted that that probably could not and did not happen. Because at the time, none of the survivors from whom contemporary statements were taken made any mention of it. And they discussed everything else. They talked about who was helping who was trying to hold somebody up in the water, who was lowering the rafts, who was lowering the boats. The statements were very, very detailed. Also, the Mendi developed a list to starboard almost immediately, and the boat sank in 20 minutes. And really, a tilting deck would not have been a platform on which you could have done the dancing. But I don't think it matters at all. All great tragedies need their myths and their legends. And this is a remarkable one. It's a message of courage and of comradeship, and it's what everybody needs in time of battle. So about 120 men are now in and with the lifeboats. And this is a painting of, supposedly, how the sinking of the Mendi must have looked like. There were hundreds more in the freezing water clinging to the rafts or wreckage or supported by their lifebelts. The Brisk sent out its own lifeboats, hailed men from megaphone, and returned with men taken from the water. But the Darrow sent no boats. Even when rafts came to the Darrow, it took the men on board, but it still didn't send out a lifeboat. And for about 2 hours, the dying in the water continued. Mr. Chite, that schoolmaster from Hebron, with the wife and children, he apparently cheered the men around him with hymns and prayers, and then he and his friends Benjamin Mohorosi and Pinafin More all drowned. The Brisk called in her boats and cruised amongst the wreckage, and the Brisk then went into Portsmouth, landed 137 survivors and a lot of dead bodies. The Darrow also went on to Portsmouth and disembarked 107 survivors. So out of 4 officers, 2 survived. Out of 17 NCOs, 7 survived. And out of 802 labourers, now known as privates, 195 survived. As you can see, the majority came from Transvaal, Transkei, Lesotholand. The Mendi survivors were then sent on to serve and work in France. Now here is Prime Minister Louis Botha. Oh, and I'm sorry, seem to be missing some pages. It was, for many years, it was unknown where the Mendi had sunk. The Mendi, this is St. Catherine's lighthouse on the Isle of Wight, and the Mendi sank about 11 miles from St. Catherine's lighthouse. Here is Prime Minister Louis Botha with his family, and on the 9th of March 1917, he made an announcement in the Houses of Parliament. Ever since the war broke out, the natives had done everything possible which was to help in the struggle without ever doing anything which was in conflict with their loyalty to the flag and the king. It has never happened in the history of South Africa, Mr. Speaker, that in one moment, by one fell swoop, such a lot of people have perished. Mr. Speaker, I think that where people have died in the way they have done, it is our duty to remember that where people have come forward of their own accord, of their own free will, that what they have done will redound to their everlasting credit. I therefore move as an unopposed motion that this House has learnt with deep regret of the sad loss of life amongst members of the South African Native Labour Contingent caused by the collision and sinking of the transport Mendi on February 21st, 1917, and resolves to record an impression of its sincere sympathy with the relatives of the deceased officers, non-commissioned officers, and natives in their bereavement. Now at Southampton, there is the Hollybrook Memorial, which has the names on it of all the seamen, soldiers, and nurses who died at sea and whose bodies were never recovered. 540 names appear at Hollybrook for the officers and privates of the South African Native Labour Corps. Others of the Native Labour Corps are buried in England, Belgium, and Dutch towns where their bodies came ashore. And as I said, they were returned to South Africa by the end of 1917. Now these are British war medals, and they were made to white officers and NCOs and the black comrades of the High Commission territories of Basutoland, Bechuanaland, and Swaziland. They were in silver to white soldiers and in bronze to black soldiers. But no medals were ever handed over to the black members of the South African Native Labour Corps. And in 1925, the Imperial Secretary's Office wrote concerning the attitude of the government of Prime Minister Hertzog. He said, "The Union Cabinet has been considering the question and has decided not to give Union natives the medals which have been awarded to them. These medals, however, have already been awarded by His Majesty, and His Majesty's government has always made a great point to keep faith most scrupulously with the natives." And the British Empire Service League, which is now known as the South African Legion, at its annual Congress in 1928 passed a resolution. Congress places on record an expression of regret that the government cannot see its way to issue the medals to the natives who served in the Native Labour Corps. And the League offered to pay for the costs of the medals itself. And when Jan Smuts became Prime Minister, he also refused to hand over the medals to those who had been awarded them. Well, the years passed, memorials were erected in towns and cities to the dead of the First World War. And I've visited a great many all over the country. And I haven't seen any which contemporaneously recorded or mentioned black South Africans who are buried in German Southwest Africa, East Africa, France, or who have no known graves. There were a number of local memorials, such as this one in Ashridgeville, erected to the victims of the Mendi. And I met a year ago the daughter of a man who, as an attorney in Johannesburg, managed the Mendi Memorial Education Fund. But the years passed, and we know from this photograph of the Sharpeville massacre that successive white South African governments became more and more repressive in its treatment of black South Africans. In 1986, P.W. Botha opened the very beautiful Delville Wood Museum in the middle of the wood. There are bronze panels which show white South Africans fighting the good fight, coming out of the wood. But there is one panel tucked away. This one is highlighted, and it shows the men on the Mendi. But it was never really intended that history would be shared. The Mendi wreck was located by sonar scan. It is not a war cemetery, although there are many dead in the ship, and it is not being excavated. And about 77 years after the Mendi sank, belatedly we began nation building. Through people, through words, through symbols, shared activity, shared crazy enthusiasms, in naming ships such as the SS Mendi, in naming the Isaac Joba, and last year in 2016, at that very same cemetery of Ark Labatel, the South African military paraded in style. And it was the body of the first South African labourer who died in France, Private Nyengwa Baleza. He was exhumed and he was transported to Delville Wood. And unfortunately, I haven't got a photograph, but Castor and Pollux remain above that arch. He was interred in the centre of the museum. And behind the Castor and Pollux, and at the entrance to the museum, a new wall has just been erected. The wall is along this side. And it is remarkable, but it is possible, that the name of every single South African who died in the First World War is on these two walls. And I've checked those, I know. White men in East Africa, white women in France, white men in Belgium, and black men in France, whether they have known graves or not. And the way it's been done is alphabetically. So it's very integrated, it's very natural, it flows very nicely. When I went on my trip to France this year, one of the people I went with, Peter Cartwright, had no relatives on the trip. But then as we're looking at the wall, he sees somebody K, K-E-A-Y, and he gets terribly excited, and he emails around South Africa, and it turns out he had an unknown great-uncle. And the unknown great-uncle has no known grave, is on the Tiapva Memorial. Well, we go to the Tiapva Memorial the next day. Peter finds his name. Peter weeps. Tony, his partner, weeps. I weep. Miranda, that I entered school in standards at aged 5 years old, she weeps. And here were 10 people weeping over a great-uncle that nobody even knew existed until the day before. But here is the new wall. And as you can see, Templin, Tan, Tang, Tan, Tani, Tankabong, Tankabong, Tan, Tana, Tana, Tanoni. It is all South Africans. So it seems very strange that about 100 years later, the Mendi tragedy is now contributing to nation building through emphasizing that we actually do have a shared history. And it's very strange that in including black South African history, which has been ignored for so long, white South African history is affirmed and vice versa. Thank you.